All right, so the work that we do in the Killer Bee Inquiries is actually work that ends your suffering, as opposed to a lot of other techniques or modalities that teach you how to manage your suffering. So what does that mean, and what does that look like? Well, first we have to define what suffering is. When you're dealing with general forms of what most of us would term suffering, like depression, anxiety, addiction, or chronic pain, among many others, what you're really dealing with at root is the unconscious repression of buried emotions in the body. Repression, unlike suppression, is when we're unknowingly holding something down or back. You've probably heard of repressed memories, right? They're memories we don't know about that are stuck deep down in the body. Well, this is the same thing, but with emotions. When they're repressed, we don't know that they're there. And the repression itself, or the holding back or holding down of these emotions or memories, is what causes the suffering, right? I think that's an important point to make, that we're not suffering because of what we're feeling, we're suffering because of what we're not feeling. And so if suffering equals the mechanism of emotional repression, the end of suffering is to resolve or come out of that emotional repression. And how do we do that? Well, you're not gonna like it. We have to see through ourselves, meaning we have to deconstruct what we think is true by questioning our beliefs, our identities, and our worldviews. Basically, we have to call ourselves on our own bullshit. And insanely, most people would rather continue on in their repression and suffering than to try and tackle that. This is why we in the Killer Bee Inquiries often say it's safer to suffer than it is to feel and express what's true. It's safer to suffer than it is to come out of emotional repression and end suffering. Because you basically have to end your own world, right? Which means to question and throw out everything you've been programmed to believe up until now. Because that's where emotional repression hides, in our programming. Let me give you a common example. Let's say early on you were conditioned to believe that you are responsible for other people's pain. This identity of I'm responsible or it's my fault might be so deep that you don't even know that it's a belief. You just feel like that's the truth, right? I am responsible for other people's pain. What you might not know or remember is that at some point you had to take that identity or that belief on, and probably in your family of origin, and you had feelings about that. You had feelings that you had to start believing that about yourself. You had feelings that you had to start believing anything about yourself or others or the world. If they were feelings of anger, but it wasn't safe to feel and express anger to your caregivers, you're gonna show up as hurt and afraid. And in order to keep that anger buried, you're gonna believe I'm responsible for their pain. Or if you had feelings of hurt and sadness, but it wasn't safe to feel and express hurt or sadness, you're gonna show up as angry, defensive, and irritable. And in order to keep that sadness or hurt buried, you're gonna believe it's my fault. Either way, the mechanics of it are, we have to believe things about ourselves so we don't have to acknowledge, access, feel, or express what's really true deep down. And so to end your suffering or to end your own world means to put everything on the table for inquiry, right? We have to basically throw out the baby and the bathwater. This means identities like I'm responsible for their pain, or it's my fault, deficiency stories like I'm not good enough, or I'm a bad person, worldviews like I can't trust anybody or the world is unsafe, diagnoses like I'm depressed or I'm ADHD, even religious beliefs and identities like, I'm a Buddhist or I'm a Christian or whatever. All of these things have to be questioned, not because they're not true, but because they're hiding places for repression and buried emotions. If you want to test it for yourself, just take something that you really deeply believe and challenge it, right? So let's say you have a belief that you're not good enough. Say to yourself, I am good enough. If you have a contraction or a response in the body that tightens up like that, that's where your buried emotions and repression live. It's also the root of suffering. And if you process it, along with everything else that you deeply believe, then you'll come out of emotional repression and you'll end your suffering. You won't have to believe I'm not good enough anymore. Anyhow, if this sounds like it has your name on it, then visit repressiontest.com.